Hello guys and welcome to this new tutorial. So it's been a while since my last tutorial, and in my last tutorial we talked about the multiplayer framework. In that video I showed you all kinds of classes for Unreal Engine, and I also showed you the relationship between these classes. So basically we had this blueprint there, and in this blueprint I explained what, for instance, a game mode is and what it is useful for. I also explained the location of the game mode, so that the game mode only exists on the server, for example. Then we took a look at the game state, and I explained that that exists on the server and the client. We took a look at the player state. We took a look at what a pawn is, or a character class blueprint. I explained what a player controller is and that it exists on the server and on the owning client. And then I also explained the use case of, for instance, the player controller and these other classes. And then finally I explained what widgets are and that they exist on the owning client, and also what the relationship between widgets and the player controller are. And in this video, I also gave you these little examples. So for instance, I gave you an example of respawning a player. So the example was, if in the player controller you press P, for example, you call a function called respawn player, and on the server that will then call a respawn function that exists inside of our game mode. And inside of the game mode, that little function called spawn a player would then actually spawn our player. And then I also explained why we do it like this. So why do we call from the player controller something on the server? And why does a function like respawning, why do I install it on the game mode? Well, so that we just keep those kinds of functions away from the clients as much as possible, basically. And since the game mode is intended to code your rules, something like respawning can be seen as a rule, and that's also a good reason why we install something like that on the game mode, for example. So, okay, now that we looked at all of this basic framework, I think it is important that we start to look at how we can actually apply this in our multiplayer game. And that's the reason for this video. In this video, I want to basically explain how we can properly set up a basic setup for your game. So once you download our engine and you want to get started with multiplayer, what is the type of setup that we should do? And what's the code that we need to write in the beginning to make our multiplayer game work and have a good functioning setup that we can actually build and expand upon. So let's take a look at that and let's actually see how this is all applied here. So what I've done so far is simply inside of my content folder, we got this little tutorial folder here. Here I got all these tutorials. You can download this project on our Patreon, as you guys know. So if you want to have access to this, you can get it there. So right now we have this tutorial based setup folder and we have a blueprints folder. So the first thing we want to do, as explained in the last video, is we want to assign a game mode to this level, because a game mode controls all of our other classes, and in these classes we can code the logic for our game. So the first thing that we're going to do here is right click, go to blueprint class, click on all classes here, and we're going to type in game mode. And then, as explained, we do not want the game mode base, because that's better suited for single player games, but we want the actual game mode class, because that has some handy features for multiplayer. So let's select game mode and click on select. And then I'm gonna use my usual acronyms here. So that's called BP_GM_, and then you can give your game mode a specific name. So you can have a gameplay game mode, you can have a main menu game mode, etc, etc. And of course your game can have multiple game modes if you have, for instance, a free-for-all game and a team deathmatch game, for example. So in this example, I'm just going to call it BPGM base setup, since this is like a base setup tutorial. Now we can go ahead and assign this blueprint here to this level. So if I select it, I can click on this little dot here. And now my BPGM base setup is assigned to this level. You can also simply click on the drop down here and find your game mode over here. Now, like I said, this BP_GM, it's an acronym, so you can call it whatever. The actual name doesn't matter, but this is just a way of structuring your projects. And since we also make marketplace products, this is the setup that they require us for the marketplace. That's why I use this setup here. Okay, the next thing that we're gonna make is, let's make a game state. So let's type in game state. Yet again, we do not want the base game state, but we just want game state class. So let's click on that and call this BPGS for game state. And then our name here, base setup. All right. Then we want to assign the base setup to this game mode base. So let's click on game state here, click on base setup. Then the next class that we're going to make is player state. So let's type in player state. Here we go, this one. Click. BP underscore PS underscore base setup. And then the next thing, right click here is a player controller. You can find that one on top here. So let's type in BP PC base setup. Okay, and then we still need to assign our player state and player controller. So player controller, click it here, base setup, and here you see player state, click it and click on base setup. Okay, now that we have all of this defined, we can also define a character here. But what I want to do, and what is a better setup for code, is that you do not define your base character in here, because right now I could just go for my third person character, which is the Unreal Engine mannequin, but actually I want to set this to none. And the reason for that is, if you make a typical game, it's not gonna suffice to just install your class here as a default pawn. And the reason for that is that, let's say that your pawn dies, then what happens? Because this only works as soon as you click play one time, then you typically spawn with your character. So if I install my character there, like this one, and I click on spawn, then I become this guy. If this guy dies now, then what? So because of that simple reason, we already just want to by default click on none, and we want to spawn this character with code. Okay, so how do we go from here? Well, obviously in a game you do need a character. So my character's over here in the assets folder, and then we go to templates. Then I use the third person character, and this character has some simple code. All it is some simple basic code to make the character move, basically. So nothing special, but it's good to know that we have a character here that we can use. Okay, let's get back to it. So what's the first thing that I typically do when I create a multiplayer game? What is my basic setup? Well, first thing I do is that I go to the game mode. And the reason is because in a multiplayer game, obviously your players are going to connect and they are going to disconnect. And once a player connects and disconnects, I want to store that player somewhere so that on the server, if I am, for instance, the host of the match, or if I'm a dedicated server, it doesn't really matter. I just want to have an overview of the players that are in my session at the moment so that I can control them, have information of them, and so that I can share that information with the connected clients. A good example of this is, for instance, let's say you have a player list. I want to have my character in the world. I want to press a tab and I want to see a player list of the connected players. So because of that, I need to have that information on the server. And a good place where you can get that type of information is, for instance, here in the game mode. You could store the information here so that you can control these players. So another place where you can store that information is here in the game state, since it also has to do with the state of the game. And here is actually a variable that you can call that contains all of these players. So we'll get to this in a minute. But first, let's look at the game mode where we will start up this setup. So if a player connects, then what happens? Because we see here we have begin play and we have event tick. Well, in the game mode and only in the game mode, we have an event called OnPostLogin. So here we see under the game category, we see event OnPostLogin. If we hover over it, it says notification that a player has successfully logged in and has been given a player controller. So let's click this. So the moment that a player actually connects to the session via, for instance, just joining the session, right? So you host a session, you find a session, then you connect to a session. Then inside of the game mode, which only exists on the server, this event here gets called because it says here notification, basically. So this gets called, this notifies the game mode that a player connected and that the guy has a player controller. So out of new player here, we also see that this is an object reference of a player controller. So what does this mean? Well, as soon as this guy connects to the session, this happens, and the guy that connects is this player controller. So what can we already do here? Well, we can store a reference of this player controller so that we already know about one player who that player is. But instead of storing a reference here, let's store an array so that we know for each player that connects who it is. So the first thing that we're going to do here, if a player connects, we're going to make a copy of that player. So let's go ahead and right click and promote it to variable. And if we click away, we see here, this is called new player and it's of the type player controller. Well, this is just one player controller, but we want to store every single player controller. So let's go ahead, disconnect this, select this variable. And what we're going to do is here on the top right, if we click on it, here in the top right, instead of having it just be a single, we want to be an array. So let's change the variable type. All right, now let's hit compile. and select variable again. So what is an array? Well, in an array, we can store multiple players right now. So all these players can go into this array, and then we have an overview of everybody that connected basically. And that overview will look like this. If I click here on the plus, here you will see all of these player controllers that are connected. So how do we do this? How do we store all of these player controllers here? I just cleared it out, by the way. We grab this variable into the scene here, and then we drag off of it and we type in add. And then we can click on the add here. And that's how we can add this player that's incoming to this array of player controllers. So let's add it like this. And then let's actually rename this variable because now it's called new player. So let's call this something like all PCs, which stands for all player controllers. This can also be called all players. Okay, so now every time a player connects, I have a copy of that guy inside of this variable, which means now on my server, I have all my players that are connected in here. And why do I want that? Well, let's say I want to make, for instance, I want to send this information to the connected clients at some point. Or let's say that a timer runs of 30 seconds, and after 30 seconds, I want the server to spawn everybody at a certain location because the game is about to start. Then the server can now do this because the server has this information. So how would the server do something like that? Well, if we hold F and left click, we get a for each loop. And now the server could do certain functionality for every player that is in here. So here we get a player controller, and we can have all these player controllers teleport them to a certain location, for example. So that's why it's a good reason to store a copy of all your connected players. Then let's look at another node, which is called OnSwapPlayerControllers. And this function over here, if we hover over it, it says called when a player controller is swapped to a new one during seamless travel. So what's the difference between this one and this one? Well, we see here that we have a reference of the old player controller and we have a reference of a new player controller. And like I said, during seamless travel, this event here gets called. So what is seamless travel? Well, let's say that you are in your game, your session, which is a lobby. Players then connect. They then connect on the OnPostLogin gets called. Because this, as it says here, when you log in. And this login only happens once when the player connects. Now let's say that you as the whole server, you guys travel from a lobby level to a gameplay level. At that point, you are already logged into this session, so this one will not get called again. But I do leave from one level to another level, which means I go from one actual physical level, like this, to another physical level, which means my game mode over here also gets reloaded and is completely new. And you know what that means. Once I go to the second level, this variable here where we just added everybody is now completely empty. So how do we then basically get that variable again? Well, you guessed it. If we swap the level, we want to just do the same thing. With all the new player controllers, we want to add them here as well. So when we travel level, I still have a copy of all of my connected players. All right, and now let's go for the last situation, which is if we are inside of that lobby, let's say that players disconnect, because here we just add somebody every time they connect. What if they disconnect? Then my array here, which contains the information of the connected players, is no longer up to date. Okay, so to handle that, we have an event which only exists inside of the game mode, just like these two other events, which is called OnLogout. And it's also of the game category, and if you hover over it, it says implementable event when a controller with a player state leaves the game. Well, a controller with a player state, that is essentially a player. So here we have a reference also of the exiting controller. Unreal Engine names it a bit different. Here we have a player controller object, here we have a player controller, and here we just have a controller object reference. Okay, so when the player logs out, I also have a reference of who logs out, and then I can do something with that player. What is something like this useful for? Well, for one, updating this array so that we have an accurate array of the players that are in my session. So over here, we can now type remove, and I want to remove an item. So let's say we have this array. I want to remove a disconnecting player. So this guy needs to go in here. Well, as you see, since this is the controller reference and this is player controller, so this is also player controller reference, this cannot connect. So the first thing you're going to have to do here is that from this exiting, you're going to have to cast. And you're going to have to cast to the controller that's exiting. And as we see here, for this whole game mode setup, we have the BPPC base setup. So over here, what we're going to do is we're going to do a simple cast to BP, and then we need this blueprint player controller base setup. And this guy is the guy that we want to remove from this UI over here. So what you could also do, as you see, this is only a player controller reference. You could also have this be a direct reference of the player controller that you use inside of your game mode. So it could also be a direct reference of this BPPC base setup, and then you do not have to cast every time that you use this. So let's say I do a for each loop with this variable over here. Now I want to execute an event that exists on that player controller. Then first I have to actually cast. So the first thing I'm going to have to do, if I want to communicate with each of these players' player controller and call an event there, like let's say pop up some UI on their screens, for example, then I'm going to have to cast. Now, as you can imagine, if I put this cast in between here and basically straight away from the connecting player controller, do the cast and then basically store that as a reference in here and don't have this be of the type player controller, but have this be directly of the type BPPC base setup. This one, and then this object reference as an array, so you still have to make an array out of it. Then I do not have to do this cast here anymore, because of that point the cast is already made over here. But that's just a matter of optimization. So for now I'm gonna keep it like this, and on the event logout I can simply do the cast over here and remove that guy from my player controller. So what did we realize here? Well, as we see here we have a disconnection. So let's call it event for when a player disconnects, right? That's what we have over here. And what do we have over here? Events for when a player connects. So what did we realize now? And let's remove this. So what did we realize now inside of our multiplayer game? Well, we realized player connection / disconnection. If I can type correctly. So like this, let's make this darker because that looks cool. Boom. So now we realized in our multiplayer game, player connection and player disconnection, and we have this array. Okay, so that's great. This now exists on the server. This variable, I can set it to replicate, but that's not going to do anything because as I explained in the last video, and if you haven't watched it, please watch that so you understand this. The game mode only exists on the server, and because it only exists on the server, I cannot replicate this variable down to clients. So inside of anything that you code inside of your game mode, setting a variable to replicate doesn't make any sense because it only exists on the server. So who is it going to replicate that to? Nobody. It cannot replicate. Only classes like a GameState, player controller, character can replicate. Actually, like everything else except for the game mode and the widgets can replicate basically. So, okay. Now we manage this. Now what is next? Let's go back to this screen here. So now inside of the game mode, we have some connections set up. That's the first thing that we require. Then let's take a look at the game state, because I told you guys in the game state, we can also have information about all of the connected players. And that's true. Just like in the game mode, we have specific events that only exist here. In the game state, we have that too, but in the form of variables. If you right click over here, you can then type in game state, and then you can find stuff that is specific to the game state and game state only. So for instance, if we scroll down over here, we can see variables that exist inside of this game state. So we can get here a copy of the game mode. For instance, we can just pull here. We can get elapsed time. That's a variable that's available for us. We can get the game mode class that we currently have. We can get the match state. So inside of the game mode, we can have a state of the match. You can also code this yourself, or you can use the built-in Unreal Engine stuff. We can have this very nice variable called getPlayerArray, and then these two other variables. But the most important one here, useful one here, is this getPlayerArray. So let's click on it and let's hover over it. So as it says here, read the value of variable PlayerArray, array of all player states maintained both on the server and clients. Player states are always relevant. And this variable here, we cannot set anything on it. It's just a variable that we can get information from. So what does this mean? Well, as we saw over here, players connect and stuff, and then we store a copy of them inside of our self-made variable so that we can basically have this variable and have control over these players. But over here, we already get a variable by default, which contains our player states. So every time a player basically connects to our game, Then they log into the game, and at that point they get, for instance, a player controller as we saw in the game mode, but players that we have in our game also have a player state. And this game state automatically keeps track of all these connected player states. So why is that useful? Well, now we don't only have to use the game mode anymore to keep track of all of these players, because the game mode can keep track of these player controllers, but the game state can also keep track of all of these player states. So what does that look like? Why is that useful? Well, from this array, for example, just like from this array, we can call those player controllers and do something there. We can also just use this one and get the player state, and from the player state get the player controllers. So what does that look like? If I do a for each loop through these connected players here, and this array automatically gets updated, by the way. If people connect or disconnect, this one automatically gets updated, and we do not have to make our own code like this, because this is our own custom variable. We don't have to do that. Here this automatically happens. So what's useful in this one? Well, here we get a player state object reference. So what we can do, for example, is we can do get player controller. And from this player controller that is connected to this player state, we can then do cast to BP-PC, and then not framework, but BP-PC base setup, which is this tutorial. So now in the game state, we can also loop through all of this and call functions on every single player, for example. So yeah, this is the same. We can do it here, or we can do it here. And on both of these classes, we can have an array and an insight and overview of all of our connected players. All right, so if you talk about something like, for instance, a player list, then you could fetch that information of the player list from something like a game mode, or you could fetch that information from a player list from something like a game state. All right, I think that's a good base setup that we need to discuss here. This video is already getting quite long. I think I'm gonna round this video up now, guys, and in the next video I'm gonna walk you guys through, now that we discussed basically this connection process, let's talk in the next video about how we can actually initialize our player data. So let's say a player connects to a match. That player has information which is, for example, saved in a save game, such as his username, his profile, his avatar and such. Then how can we basically connect a player, have the player fetch that information, have the player put certain information inside of the player state so that it's replicated to other players, and how can the player then initialize his own user interface to display his own information in, and eventually how can the player spawn his own character, because as you saw, we put this default pawn class here to none, so we don't spawn the player anymore. So now we want to do that with code. So how does that work? Well, let's talk about that in the next video, because this one is getting quite long. All right, guys, have a good day. Bye bye.